up, it's the Broncos on the clock. It's now the Arizona Cardinals selection. They're on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Green Bay Packers. It's the Detroit Lions now on the clock. The Tennessee Titans are now on the clock. Colts now on the clock. The New Orleans Saints are now on the clock. The Los Angeles Rams now on the clock. Now the Seattle Seahawks are on the clock. With the next pick, the Raiders are on the clock. The Chicago Bears are on the clock now. With the next pick, the Jacksonville Jaguars are on the clock. On the clock now, the Chicago Bears. And now, on the clock, it's the Arizona Cardinals. On the clock now, the Buffalo Bills. On the clock now, the Houston Texans. On the clock now, it's the Miami Dolphins. The Pittsburgh Steelers on the clock now. Next up, the Commanders are on the clock. Next up, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are on the clock. The San Francisco 49ers are now on the clock. With the next selection, the Ravens are on the clock. It's the Philadelphia Eagles now on the clock. Saints. The Arizona Cardinals are now on the clock. The Detroit Lions now on the clock. Now on the clock, the Giants. The Philadelphia Eagles on the clock now. On the clock now, the Los Angeles Rams. The Las Vegas Raiders are on the clock. The Jaguars are on the clock now. It's the Carolina Panthers now on the clock. The Houston Texans are now on the clock. It's the Buffalo Bills now on the clock. With the next selection, the Browns are on the clock. Next up, it's the Packers on the clock. It's the Cowboys now on the clock. The Bengals now on the clock. The Chiefs are on the clock. Now on the clock, the San Francisco 49ers. The Baltimore Ravens are on the clock now. Up next, the Philadelphia Eagles are on the clock. Next up, it's the Seahawks on the clock. The New York Jets are now on the clock. The Cardinals on the clock now. The Denver Broncos are now on the clock. The Seattle Seahawks are now on the clock. It's the Bears now on the clock. The Jaguars are on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Atlanta Falcons. It's now the Arizona Cardinals selection. They're on the clock. It's the New England Patriots now on the clock. Next up, it's the Dolphins on the clock. With the next selection, it's the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now on the clock, the Washington Commanders. And now on the clock, the Minnesota Vikings. It's now the San Francisco 49ers pick. They're up. On the clock now, the Baltimore Ravens. Now we turn to the Eagles. They're on the clock. Next up, the Jets are on the clock. The New York Jets on the clock now. With the next selection, the New York Jets. On the clock now, the Jacksonville Jaguars. On the clock now, the Seattle Seahawks. The Chicago Bears are now on the clock. It's the Atlanta Falcons now on the clock. Now on the clock, the Texans. Next up, the Patriots are on the clock. With the next pick, the Miami Dolphins are on the clock. The Pittsburgh Steelers are now on the clock. The Washington Commanders are now on the clock. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are on the clock. The 49ers on the clock now. The Baltimore Ravens now on the clock. The Chicago Bears are on the clock now. On the clock now, it's the Denver Broncos. And now, on the clock, it's the Arizona Cardinals. With the next selection, the Lions are on the clock. Next up, the Indianapolis Colts are on the clock. With the next selection, the Saints are on the clock. Now on the clock, the Rams. Now the Seattle Seahawks are on the clock. On the clock now, the Chicago Bears. The Atlanta Falcons are now on the clock. On the clock now, the Houston Texans. On the clock now, the New England Patriots. The Miami Dolphins now on the clock. It's the Steelers now on the clock. With the next selection, it's the Washington Commanders. It's the Philadelphia Eagles now on the clock. The Carolina Panthers now on the clock. With the next selection, the Ravens are on the clock. The Arizona Cardinals are now on the clock. The Los Angeles Rams are up. They're on the clock. With the next selection, the Carolina Panthers on the clock. On the clock now, the Detroit Lions. With the next selection, the Falcons are on the clock. And now on the clock, it's the 49ers. It's the New Orleans Saints, now on the clock. Next up, it's the Seahawks on the clock. It's the Bears now on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Atlanta Falcons. The Cleveland Browns are now on the clock. Philadelphia Eagles on the clock now. The New England Patriots are now on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Miami Dolphins. The Pittsburgh Steelers on the clock now. Next up, the Commanders are on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The San Francisco 49ers are now on the clock. It's the Cleveland Browns now on the clock. The New Orleans Saints are now on the clock. The Denver Broncos are on the clock. The Baltimore Ravens are on the clock now. The Las Vegas Raiders now on the clock. On the clock now, the Houston Texans. Next up, it's the Broncos on the clock. The Dallas Cowboys are now on the clock. Now on the clock, the San Francisco 49ers. Next up, the Cleveland Browns are on the clock. There has been a trade. The Houston Texans are now on the clock. Now on the clock, it's the Las Vegas Raiders. Next up, it's the Dolphins on the clock. With the next selection, it's the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now on the clock, the Washington Commanders. It's the Bucs, now on the clock. On the clock now, the Baltimore Ravens. It's the New England Patriots, now on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Tennessee Titans. It's now the Indianapolis Colts selection.